What's going on, growers? It's James Prigioni coming to you live from Jersey. 10 years of growing tomatoes has led to this. Today, me and Tuck are going to show you how to grow your own tomatoes in your backyard. Let's go! Tomatoes are one of the most rewarding crops to grow in the garden, and there's thousands of varieties. Everything ranging from beefsteaks to small cherry tomatoes. There's even colors like yellow, orange, red, white, even blue. So our tomatoes are bred for specific reasons. We have tomatoes that are good for slicing, like our big beefsteak tomatoes. One of my favorite ones of those are the soldaki tomatoes. So perfect for sandwiches. Some tomatoes are also bred for things like salads and snacking. Those are a lot of our little cherry tomatoes. One of my favorite of all time of those is the Sungold Cherry. And then we have what are called paste tomatoes. These are perfect for things like cooking, canning, and making juices. When it comes to growing tomatoes, one of the toughest and also one of the most fun things about them is trying to choose which variety of tomatoes to grow. And if this is your first year, you could pick up some plants that are already started at your local nursery or your local big box store. They're typically going to have some hybrids that do well for your local environment. But if you want to tap into the thousands of tomato varieties out there, all the incredible different kinds, then you're going to have to start your own tomatoes from seed. Later on in the video, I'll go into detail of where I like to get my seeds from and more about variety selection. But for now, let's get into the actual act of planting the tomatoes, growing them, and so we can get closer to harvesting. After we choose which varieties of tomatoes we want to grow, the next thing to do is start prepping and planting. Generally, it's suggested to plant your tomato seeds about 6 to 8 weeks before your last expected frost date. This way your plants can get relatively large before it starts to get too nice out. But if you're a new gardener, then I suggest that you don't plant your tomatoes any earlier than 6 weeks before your last expected frost date. Sometimes planting too early can be as big of a hassle or even more than planting too late. So the secret is to actually record in your garden journal when you're transplanting your tomatoes into the ground. This way the following years you can reference that and then count back the weeks of when you should plant your seeds specific to your location. When starting seeds, I prefer using a good quality seed cell, one that will last a couple of years. And when it comes to potting mixes, I like a good organic one. My favorite potting mix of all time is Happy Frog soil. And when we're getting our potting mix ready to use into the cells, we want to make sure that it's damp. We don't want it to be dry and we don't want it to be soggy, just damp. If you may need to just add a little water to yours and mix it up to get that good damp consistency, because again, we don't want that dry soil going into those blocks. When I fill my blocks up, my seed cells, what I like to do is kind of shake them up just a little bit to make sure all the soil settles to the bottom. I don't want to push or force the soil into there, just shake it up and let it go in naturally. After they're full, I just dust the top off, and then my seeds are actually ready to be planted into the cell. So what I like to do is just to take like the back of a pen or something, or the back of a marker, because tomatoes like to be planted about 1/4 inch deep. So I'll just make a depression about 1/4 inch deep with the back of a pen. Then I'll go around and just place all my tomato seeds right into there. Then just lightly cover it up with a little bit of soil. After that, I do a light watering just to help settle the soil down and also to help fill any air gaps that might have been there. After that, I take my little plastic greenhouse cover and cover up my seed cell. What this does is create the greenhouse effect, so there's higher humidity and the top of my soil doesn't dry out too quickly. The tomato seeds that we planted will germinate based on the temperature of the soil. For instance, if the soil is about 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, then the tomato seeds will only take about a week to germinate. But if your temperature of the soil is like 60 degrees Fahrenheit, then your tomato seeds will take up to 2 weeks to germinate. So what I like to do is try to create ideal conditions for germination. What I do is after I have my whole cell planted, I'll leave that cell inside, and underneath my seed cell, I'll put a heating mat. I don't leave this heating mat on all the time, but I like to just keep it underneath it to try to raise that soil temperature to about that 85 degrees. Then after about 5 days, I'll check on my seedlings, and if I start to see some of the seedlings bending out of the soil, then I'll bring that tray into the greenhouse. What I like to do is bring that tray in the greenhouse before my seeds actually pop out of the soil. Because if they pop out of the soil when they're in the house in a relatively dark spot, then those seedlings are going to get really weak and leggy, and that's what I'm trying to avoid. If you don't have a greenhouse like I do, you can start your seedlings on like a south-facing window in your house. Just know that you may need some supplemental lighting if you want some strong and sturdy plants. To make sure my tomato plants are strong and sturdy, what I like to do is before they even pop up, I'll bring them into the greenhouse. And once they're out of the ground, I'll make sure the temperatures are in the high 50s, low 60s. I'll also make sure I have a fan consistently on my young seedlings. This helps make them strong and sturdy also, helps mimic the wind and what they're used to. At this stage, you want to make sure you're not drowning your plants. You want to make sure they have adequate water, but you don't ever want your plants sitting in water. That's really negative for the young seedlings. You want to make sure that they're damp, but you don't want to overwater at this stage. Once your plants start to show their first true leaves, now you can start actually transplanting them into larger pots. So at this stage, you can either use some homemade soil or you can use the Happy Frog soil, my favorite stuff, or whatever organic soil works for you. When transplanting, we want to make sure we step up into a larger pot. For instance, I'll go from my small seed cells to like a 4-inch pot or even like solo cups, but we don't want to go to a huge 5-gallon pot. We want a gradual step up. I fill my pots to about halfway with soil. Then I get my tomatoes and I gently transplant them into my new pots. While I'm doing this, I make sure to inoculate my roots with the mycorrhizal association. This helps with all stages of growth. Then I gently put my new tomato plants into their pots, and when I backfill the soil, I make sure to bury them a little deeper than they came out of the cells because the tomatoes will actually root from their stems. So I'll bury them in. After that, I'll water the plants in gently just to make sure I fill any gaps and stuff, and then bring that back into the greenhouse. After your tomatoes are transplanted into their new pots, you want to try to get them more light at this time now that they have their true leaves. This is the time where they're going to start really showing rapid amount of growth. And if you use the good potting mix, you shouldn't need any additional fertilizer at this time. When the weather starts getting nice out and our tomatoes have gotten larger, we must make sure that we start hardening off our tomatoes. This is one of the most common mistakes that new gardeners make. We have to realize that it's a big transition to go from a plant living inside to going outside. We don't want to do that immediately. There's a big change in humidity and airflow, temperature, and even the amount of sun. So we want that to be a gradual transition, and that's what hardening off is. So to harden off our tomato plants, at least 2 weeks before we want to start planting them into the ground, what I like to do is to bring my tomatoes outside on a nice day between around 12 and 5 o'clock when it's nice and sunny out on a calm day, and to just give them a couple hours the first day just to adjust to the outside temperatures, and then I'll bring them in. And then I'll gradually just give them more time outside until they're to the point where they can spend a few days outside, 24 hours. After that, I know that they're ready to start transplanting. Transplanting out your tomatoes is a very important process, and one of the processes that a lot of new gardeners make mistakes on. So I want to tell you right now, do not transplant out your tomatoes too early. I repeat, do not transplant out your tomatoes too early. I have done this a number of times. So let me tell you when I transplant out my tomatoes to give you an idea. My last expected frost date is April 19th. But I don't start transplanting my tomatoes into the ground until the second week of May, almost 4 weeks after my last expected frost date. In a lot of the books and stuff, they'll tell you you can plant yours out about 2 weeks after your last expected frost date, but I've had some issues with that. You don't really want to plant your transplants into the ground until the nighttime temperatures are no lower than like 45, 50 degrees. Even if you get those plants in early and the temperatures aren't great, and if frost doesn't come, they're just going to sit there. They're not going to grow incredibly well. And if a frost does come, think about it. You just wasted like 8 to 10 weeks and put your tomatoes all the way back, or potentially even killed them. I'm telling you, it's not worth the worry. It's not worth the hassle, because they will not start having that vigorous, beautiful growth until the weather changes and it gets a lot nicer out. When you've decided it's a good day to start transplanting out your tomatoes, what you want to do is choose a location that gets full sun. Tomatoes will take about as much sun as you can give them. But the day of transplanting, it's good to choose a day that there's like overcast or maybe a little bit of rain, just so your tomatoes aren't shocked too much when they have to go into the ground and it's super sunny. An overcast is a better day in my opinion. So what we'll do is we'll find our location, we'll start digging back our wood chips if it's a location that we have mulch down. Then I'll dig my hole about twice the size of my pot that I'm planting from for my tomato, and then I'll take some compost or some homemade soil, put it at the bottom of my hole. After that, I'll inoculate my roots with the mycorrhizal association using this mycose just to help with the transplant shock and every other form of growth. Then I will start burying my tomato back in. I'll use some of the native soil and also a little bit of homemade compost mixed in with that. Then I'll bury my tomato plant up to the first set of leaves. The reason we do this is because tomatoes will root from the stem. So any part of the stem that we bury will actually create roots. So what we're doing is creating a bigger root system so it can support a bigger plant in the future. After I'm finished with that, I'll pull the mulch back over and then water my plants in. The spacing of your tomatoes will be dependent upon how you want to grow them. But I highly suggest you either stake your tomatoes with something like a bamboo and tie it to the stake, or you build a tomato trellis and tie your tomatoes to a trellis. This is how I get huge harvests, because both of these styles of growing tomatoes have to do with utilizing height. If we were to just let our tomatoes sprawl along the ground, then the tomatoes would need about 3 to 4 feet per tomato plant. But when we utilize the height and we grow tomatoes up things, then we can grow tomatoes 1 per square foot. So we get to utilize so much more space. The only thing with this is, if you want to grow tomatoes up stakes, or if you want to grow them up trellises, then you have to prune your tomatoes. I have videos that are specific on how to prune tomatoes and how to build a tomato trellis if that's something you want to do. Tomatoes prefer a nice deep watering. So if I feel like we haven't had enough rain, I'll go around and water my tomatoes about once a week with a good deep watering. And then once I start to see flowers forming on my tomato plants, I'll go around and give a top dressing of some compost around the bases of my plants, just to make sure they have adequate fertilization heading into production. There's a few issues that you may run into when it comes to tomato plants. Some of the things are like spider mites or aphids, things like that. If I have little issues like those, what I like to use is a spray made of cold pressed neem oil and dish soap. That's one of my favorites. Another issue you may run into is blossom end rot, and also splitting and cracking from your tomatoes. So this commonly comes from uneven watering. So one way to help negate some of these issues is to use a nice thick mulch. That's what I like to do. This helps with this a lot. But if you're still getting a lot of splitting and cracking your tomatoes, it could be the varieties that you're actually growing. Some varieties are more prone to cracking and splitting than others, and then some varieties don't crack or split at all. When we finally get to the part of harvesting our tomatoes, we don't want to do it in haste. We want to make sure that we're a bit gentle too with the harvesting process. So we don't want to go out there and just start, especially the beefsteak ones, we don't want to just start ripping the tomatoes off the plant. The best thing to do, in my opinion, is to take some pruners and gently cut the tomatoes off the vines. This way you're not disturbing the vine and causing any unnecessary stress to the plants, because a lot of these plants will produce all the way up to the frost for us. So we need to make sure we're taking care of them. If you want to grow tomato plants that will basically get as big as trees, you need to grow healthy plants and stay on top of the tying and pruning process. But you also need to grow varieties that are super prolific. Varieties like the cherry bomb tomato and the super sweet 100. That's why I suggest that a lot of you grow some hybrid tomatoes along with your heirlooms. Hybrids like the Sungold Cherry, one of my all-time favorite, and like I mentioned, the super sweet 100. I do love my heirloom tomatoes, ones like my Soldaki tomato and my Rosa de Bern, but being good at growing tomatoes, I feel like, has to do with playing around with different varieties and finding the ones that grow well with your location and ones that you actually like to eat. If you want a little more information on the varieties of tomatoes that I grow, I have a video specific on the exact varieties that are my favorite to grow in the garden. What you plan on doing with your tomatoes after you harvest them will help steer you towards the types of tomatoes you want to grow. There are really two types of tomatoes. We've got indeterminate and determinate tomatoes. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about determinate tomatoes. These are the ones less common to backyard gardeners. So determinate tomatoes will only grow about 1 to 3 feet tall. And these ones only set fruit one time and then they finish producing. That's why they're called determinate tomatoes. On the other hand, we have indeterminate tomatoes. These are about 75% of most tomatoes, and these are going to be the ones most common for us to be growing in our own backyard. The indeterminate tomatoes will grow anywhere from like 6 feet to 20 feet tall. You guys saw last year I had tomatoes well over 10 foot tall. So these tomatoes will continue to produce flowers and fruit all the way up until the frost. So as long as we keep these plants healthy, they're going to produce for an extremely long period of time. Almost all the tomatoes I grow are indeterminate tomatoes. The only real reason, in my opinion, to be growing some of the determinate tomatoes is if you want to make some tomatoes used for canning, or if you want to make things like ketchup and stuff, because the big thing about the determinate tomatoes is that they all produce fruit at the same exact time. When it comes to ordering tomato seeds, my two favorite places to get tomato seeds from are Baker Creek Seeds and Fedco Seeds. I'm not saying that these are the only places. I'm not saying that these are the greatest places. These are just the places that I've used in the past and have had a good experience with. That's today's video, growers. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. This is a video that me and Tuck have wanted to make for a long time, but we felt like we wanted to be more experienced before we did so. because we want to just provide you guys with as much value as possible. That's our goal. Provide you with value so you can grow as much food as possible. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share with your friends. Don't forget to check out the merch down low. Grab some of this new spring merch. This is only a limited time thing, so make sure you get one before they go. And the kneelers. This is only a limited thing as well. So if you do want a kneeler, make sure you grab one before they're sold out. I also wanted to thank one of the new channel members, Brandon Hanley. Thanks for being a part of Team Grow Dude. We appreciate it so much, and also all the new members. Thanks for directly contributing to the garden. It means so much to not only me, but also the boss Tuck. We're gonna be back at you guys with another video real soon, so just hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to hit the notification bell as well. Tuck and James will be back at you again real soon. We